facilitate troop movement, especially under fire. And that was not mentioned or not brought up at all. So there were no suffrages by the Hunt family. They may have gotten lucky, troops may have walked around them, but and again, that's not an indication that nothing occurred here. I just need to bring that to light.
Okay, understood. Before we move on from this point of trying to define or at least state that you can't definitively exclude, I want to come back to your work on behalf of Brandywine Conservancy. You were there from 1993 to 1997, correct?
Correct.
Was the area around the Brandywine battlefield under development pressure at that point in time?
Absolutely.
Did the Conservancy establish priorities as to which properties it would target for conservation associated with battle activities?
Yes.
It's not your testimony, is it, that the absence of the Crebilly Farm property from that priority list demonstrates that no activity occurred at the Crebilly Farm property?
That's correct.
Just that it wasn't a funding priority at that point in time for the Brandywine Conservancy?
Well, we, because of funding and lack thereof, we concentrated on properties that we thought were most threatened or most bloodshed, and also there was a scenic element to that as well. So most of the major and the priority properties were in the vicinity of the Brandywine, I apologize, the meeting house, Birmingham Meeting House in that vicinity in Sandy Hollow. That was one major priority area. And then there were some others, I believe, down near Chad's Ford and others west of the Brandywine River.
Okay. All right. If we could turn to Mr. Harris's text. And if we can bring up, I'm not sure what the exhibit number is, the development plan itself. A4?
A6.
A6?
Mr. Gill, for our benefit, can you tell us the name of the book that we're referring to, and again, the author?
It is called Brandywine, A Military History of the Battles that Lost Philadelphia but Saved America, September 11, 1777, by Michael C. Harris.
Thank you.
And, I'm sorry, we're going to try to toggle back and forth here between this and Exhibit A21, the Archibald map. So, Mr. Weiss, could you please turn to page 282 in the Harris text?
Yes, map.
Okay, so that's a map that is titled Assault on Birmingham Hill, 4 o'clock p.m. to 5:30 p.m. on the day of the battle, correct?
Correct.
And the extreme left flank of the British advance is identified as the Hessian Jaegers.
Yes.
Using Exhibit A6 and taking out on its face the map on page 282, where would the Jaeger advance be relative to the Crebilly Farm property?
Bear with me, these are small maps, but essentially it would be this western end, probably over these two ends of the development pieces, and then swinging down possibly as far as to the immediate east of the creek.
What do you mean by the two ends?
Well, I'm sorry, these two road systems, so it would come across these somehow and then sort of swing down right into here.
Is that generally consistent with the battlefield swath that the Chester County Planning Commission identified?
Yeah, again, give or take, that swath, I would say that's generally consistent, yes.
Okay. Now, the map on page 282, and we'll perhaps, Mr. Edelman, is there any objection if we simply mark the text, mark the book itself as an exhibit? Or would you prefer that we mark individual?
I'd rather mark individual exhibits that are testified to.
And we'll provide photocopies, but then,
Thank you. I was going to say, I'd much rather have the pages rather than the entirety of the book.
And I don't have to bring the author in to cross-examine him on each page.
all right, then we'll mark, the map on page 282 of the text as exhibit PC1. And we'll provide copies. Now, the map does indicate that the extreme left flank of the British advance, the British and Hessian advance, engaged with Stevens' division, the American line, north of Dilworth, correct?
Correct.
Is that consistent with your statement that that there might have been troop movements across the property, but not necessarily combat?
I would say that's consistent.
Okay, and can we move to exhibit A21, the Archibald map? Okay, we can't turn that, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So they have to leave it left.
I'm afraid it's going to be quite impossible.
Well, I mean, I can help a little bit with the British coming in this direction, if that helps. And this is Street Road.
Hang on, because that doesn't help for the record. In this direction, I need you to tell me a little bit better what we're talking about when you talk about this direction.
Okay, the left side of this map is oriented to the north. The British came from the north. So they were moving in this direction across Street Road and then encountered
Bob, what is this direction?
right or south. And they moved south across Street Road and then generally encountered the American forces on Birmingham Hill.
Right, for purposes of clarification for the record, realizing this exhibit is tilted, let's use north-south for my purposes, because it's going to make it a lot easier when we look back at the record. Please.
Okay,
All right, where on exhibit A21 is Birmingham Hill?
well, Birmingham Meeting House is, you can see it marked here. That's the Birmingham Cemetery, just to the, move that hand over a little bit more, right there. So Birmingham Meeting House is to the south of that. And there is a knoll there, but the main Birmingham Hill moves across here, as you see all the letters. That's where Stevens' forces generally were, according to this map.
Stevens' forces were to the east and south of the meeting house.
Yes, they actually held the Meeting House area and then came across Birmingham Road as it goes towards Route 202.
Okay, and again, the meeting house would have been in the center point of battle, while the extreme right side of the American line would have been east of the meeting house.
Extreme right side, yes.
Okay.
Although these weren't fixed fortifications, this is an extremely fluid battle, so
Okay.
things were moving throughout the day.
So my question to you was, where is Birmingham Hill? You pointed out where the Birmingham meeting house is, but where is Birmingham Hill?
Birmingham Hill is basically to the south of the hand, excuse me, and then going east towards, to some degree, towards Route 202, which is that other line.
And Bob, for the record, when you said south of the hand, where was the hand located on the
The hand at that point was located at the Birmingham Cemetery. The Birmingham Meeting House is just south of the cemetery.
Thank you.
And the hill sort of generally goes in that direction to the east, falling before it gets to Route 202.
Okay, if you could grab the text again. And I ask you to turn to page 3 15 through page 321. We're going to focus really on page 315 and 316. There's a section of the text called Assault on Stevens Division. You see that?
Yes.
Down at the bottom of page 315, there's a reference made to a Lieutenant Colonel Ludwig von Worm. You see that?
Yes.
Do you know who he was?
He was a Jaeger commander. I don't know much more about him other than that.
Was he present at the battlefield that day?
Yes, I believe he was.
Okay. Would he have been in command of or associated with the Jaeger troops that were marching, according to the map on page 282, across what is now the Crebilly farm property?
I believe he was in that general area.
Okay, so if you turn to page 316, well, excuse me, stay on 315. And I'm sorry, I'm going to do great injustice to his name. Again, Ludwig von Worm said, I saw that the enemy wanted to form us on a bare hill, so I had them greeted by our two amusettes. And this was the beginning of General Howe's column's arrival. And then the next sentence says, the bare hill described by von Worm was the eastern extension of the rise that Birmingham Meeting House sits upon. The Jaegers encountered American skirmishers on the end of this rise about 1,500 feet east of Birmingham Road. Can you show us on exhibit page 21 where that has been?
I don't think I can, because this map is not worthy of showing that. You need a topo map. There are two hills here that he may be speaking about. They're both, and according to the Michael Harris book, appear to be south of Street Road. There is a knoll that Birmingham, the cemetery area sits on, and that sort of moves almost in a slight curve to the northeast. There is then the larger ridge, this Birmingham Hill that runs across generally where all these letters are, where the main American lines were. And what the Jaegers were trying to do, and that British contingent which had split, part of it went after his forces at the cemetery and meeting house. The other force was attacking them head on, and then also trying to flank them on the Americans' far eastern end of their line. And that is where they talk about this happening in the book. Now, exactly where they encountered skirmishers, I don't know where. It could have been on Crebilly Farm. It could have been south of the road. I don't know exactly the land formations at that time and where the forests were that he also describes. I've looked at those two pages very carefully, and I've not determined exactly where he's talking about.
Okay.
Not denying where he's talking about, I just don't know where he's talking about.
In light of that uncertainty, and in light of the importance of the Battle of Brandywine, is it still your testimony that a marker or a pull-off area is the most appropriate way to further our modern understanding of the battle, or can you now be prepared to offer any thoughts on what any additional investigation or inquiry of the Crebilly Farm property might be relative to the Battle of Brandywine?
Well, I think because this skirmish element that Sean Moore has brought up in light of these plans, there may be further investigation into that. The problem is the extent that may have occurred there. I'm not trying to diminish it, just in terms of the battle at hand where there were some 26,000 troops involved. This is, it appears, a very tiny part of that entire battle. It may have occurred in this property. There may have been some skirmish. Skirmishers during this war were often put out in front of troops, in front of the lines. Again, this line was newly formed, so it wasn't like they were there for a week waiting for the British to come. But they would ride out, they would do reconnaissance, and they would also try to disrupt any advance, even demoralize the advancing armies. So whether they were there and whether they were there in force or whether there were a few soldiers there forming up, it's difficult to know exactly what was going on at that time. Because the bulk of that description then that you have in your hand then concentrates almost solely on what was happening south of Street Road and the actual assault on Birmingham Road and then the retreat by the American Army as they moved back towards Dilworth.
Was Stevens' division held the line, correct?
Stevens' division, I believe, from what I understand, held a line. Sullivan's and Sterling's dissolved and moved up towards Raleigh Road.
I don't claim to be an expert here, Mr. Wise, but is Stevens' division holding of the line was that integral to the ability for the Americans to organize an orderly retreat from the battlefield that day?
It certainly didn't hurt.
Given that, and given the title.
I mean that, it certainly wouldn't have hurt. Did they prevent the British from demolishing the American Army at that point? I don't know.
Given that possibility, and in light of the title of the book, The Battle Which We Lost But Saved America, isn't the activity of Stevens' division in light of that Jaeger advance critically important to our modern understanding of the importance of the Battle of Brandywine?
Absolutely. I think that is, and there were some other British contingents that found themselves on the far western flank and ended up coming down to Brandywine to, in my opinion, scare Washington, who was his fort, well, Wayne by now was still down at Chaps Ford waiting, thinking that was the main British assault. And I think if these few detachments hadn't come down there and started to attack the American right flank at Chaps Ford, Wayne may have stayed there. And then they definitely would have been encircled and defeated. So that's my interpretation of what's happening on the far end of the battlefield. But certainly, holding on and then retreating. Other troops came in, I think under General Greene, I may be wrong on that, around Dilworth, and really stopped the British in their tracks. By that time, the armies were exhausted, and it was the end of the day.
Bear with me one moment, please. A couple of final questions. Again, in light of how we ended our conversation a moment ago, from an historic preservation planning perspective, and again, in light of these uncertainties that we've identified here this evening, is it not prudent to shift, if it's possible, to shift development out of an area where such an important aspect of the battle might have taken place into an area of the property, the Crebilly farm property, where we all agree the likelihood of action associated with the battle is nil?
I don't know the particulars of why they planned it this way and how they planned it and for what purpose, so you'd have to talk to the developer.
That's all the questions I have on cross for Mr. Wise.
All right, thank you, Mr. Gill. Mr. Edelman, at this point, it is almost 5 minutes of 10. My preference would be to conclude the hearing for this evening because I have a feeling there's going to be sufficient additional questions and to bring Mr. Wise back in May.
I didn't want to interrupt you. Can we poll the other attorneys to ask Mr. Thompson?
We can, but there's also 38 parties and I have
I'm
board member
aware, I'm
questions.
aware of that, Mr. McKenna.
So,
I would just ask the other attorneys, do they have a sufficient number of questions based upon Mr. Wise's testimony?
Mr. Thompson, are you going to have some extensive cross?
I would like to, sir. Some time for
Ms. Labrum, are you going to have any questions?
And Frone's not here,
Frone is not here.
so it's just Mark.
In terms of counsel, correct?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, I'm just talking about, not, I meant counsel as in attorneys,
Right.
of course.
I was just letting you know, I'll have extension.
I am sure you will, I'm not gonna try to do it tonight, I was just curious.
All right, so then, any objection to continuing the hearing tonight at this point? Mr. Abel?
Not at this time, no.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue the hearing until Tuesday, May 23rd at 6 p.m. The hearing that evening will be back at Ruston. I can assure you all that the sound quality will be improved from the last time we were there. I'd like to also apologize for the fact that we have to keep moving the hearings, but that's a bit out of our control. We do not have further meeting dates beyond May scheduled at this time. However, I anticipate over the next month that will be a discussion among the board and council to try to pick additional dates. Mr. Wise will be back to finish his testimony. I believe Mr. Babbitt will likely go then, who's the fiscal impact analysis for toll. Outside of that, I can't tell you who is going to testify that evening. I hope to have more of that information prior to the hearing, and when we do, it will go out on the listserv and it will be posted on the website. Is there anything additional from the board at this point? Anything additional from council?
No.
All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Standing continuance.